It's about I mean, it's about the journey from design to dev, like, and it's also about how to write great user stories. And I'll keep the session in a way, and considering the fact that not everyone knows what a user story is, not everyone is entirely aware of what a product development life cycle is. So कुछ चीजें होंगी ऐसी जो कि बहुत बिगनर लेवल की होंगी, कुछ चीजें there might be things which might feel a bit redundant, especially for people who have a bit of experience and exposure in this industry. So just bear with me for all of us so that we can just, go through the entire thing and make sure everyone is on the same page. Let me change the view as well just to see. Hey, uh, all right. Okay. Um, right. So let's start. Oh, okay. So, I mean, we've already gone over this. The purpose of this entire this session is to discuss the challenges which people face, or rather people, more than people, just like product teams face when they're trying to take an idea or take a feature from design to development, and the inefficiencies that surround that thing. So let's start off with the process of a product development life cycle. So the product development life cycle, it's where it involves design thinking as well to a good extent, but it's also where we have an idea, we design that idea, we design के बाद sorry, we have an idea, we do research on it, we design for that idea, design को फिर हम product development में लेकर जाते हैं, and then we eventually end up with a fully tested market ready product that goes out into the market, and then it keeps on evolving as well. So there are certain steps which are industry-wide accepted as the product development life cycle. So let's look at those. Uh, Firstly, of course, we have developing the idea, then we have validating the idea, then you build the design, build a prototype. You, you know, Once the prototype is ready, once development is about to start, you build the copy around it, you build the messaging around it, to build a brand around that idea as well. Whether it's a feature or a product, you have to, of course, properly make sure that it enters the market at a good point in the correct way as well. Then you build the product, release the product, and improve the product. So, I mean, there are multiple ways to categorize this, but I feel like this is a good way to do it. This is a good list. और इसमें ये है कि the first two, developing and validating, that's the research phase. जहाँ पे आपकी research होती है, you make sure that your idea is good enough to develop. Excuse me, because if the idea is not good enough to develop, then there is no point in developing the idea and or building the product, because then it won't, really succeed. So once the research has been done, research के बाद फिर आपकी construction आती है. Construction is you do everything over there. You design it, you build the prototype, you test it out. Design phase पे testing होती है, design phase में iterations आती हैं, then you start building the product. It goes into development, it goes into the entire whichever method your team is following, whether it's going with Agile or something else. जिस तरह से भी developers ने काम करना है, they do it. They make sure that the product is developed, tested, completely. I mean, they try for foolproof. I haven't yet seen a newly launched product that has no bugs or no issues, even like बहुत पुराने products के अंदर bugs आ रहे होते हैं. But they make sure, the development team makes sure that there are no bugs, and then they launch the product, they test it out in the market, they make iterations, they keep on evolving, and that's where, I mean, the cycle repeats itself, but that's technically where it ends as well, on improving the product. अब इस चीज को पूरे को लेकर जाना, uh, the biggest question, the biggest challenge over here is how to go through this entire thing, this entire life cycle with the least amount of inefficiencies. Because जितनी आपकी inefficiencies ज़्यादा होगी, the more time it will take, the more resources it will take, the more uh, cost it will incur. और अगर आपके पास जो है वो unlimited budget हो, unlimited time हो, unlimited resources हो, then these are things that you don't need to worry about. लेकिन ऐसा नहीं होता. You never have infinite resources. There are always a time limit or a budget limit or a resource limit. 2 महीनों में ये प्रोडक्ट लॉन्च करनी है, 3 हफ्तों में जो है ना ये वाला फीचर रिलीज करना है, वट एवर द एंटायर थिंग माइट बी, वट एवर द कंस्ट्रेंट माइट बी, those constraints require you to be as efficient as possible. And Efficiency is something that can only be achieved if the communication is top notch. अगर आपकी communication अच्छी नहीं है across the entire team, then achieving that level of efficiency, or rather reducing the level of inefficiency, is very very difficult. और उसमें फिर ये होता है कि there are multiple ways of having a better communication. और जो communication gap आपका सबसे ज़्यादा आता है within a product team, at least what I've seen in my experience, what I've seen across the industry as well, is the communication between design and development. आपके पास एक आइडिया होता है, आप वो आइडिया को उसको जो है ना, यू विजुअलाइज दैट आइडिया, यू मेक द फ्लोर्स, द स्क्रीन्स, द वायरफ्रेम, वट एवर यू मेक, जहाँ पे भी आपने बनाना है बनाओ, विच एवर सॉफ्टवेयर यू यूजिंग. Once the design is ready, the product looks good. Uh, you move it to development. Development के through product गुजरती है, and this is not to offend any developers out there on the call right now, but development के through product गुजरती है and it doesn't turn out how it looks in the design. फिर बैठ के सब लोग जो है सोच रहे होते हैं कि यार डिजाइन तो इस तरह का बना था, डेवलप इस तरह क्यों, ये व्हाट वेंट रॉन्ग, वेयर डिड वी गो रॉन्ग. There are some features that might not be working. There are some edge cases that might not have been covered. There are some uh, scenarios that might not even be, just user के पास बहुत ही product, but it's just not working the way it's supposed to work, or maybe the research is not good enough, or maybe the something is missing, right? So वहाँ पे usually it boils down to the fact that the communication at the early stages of construction, when you go from research to construction, between those stages, आपकी communication was not good enough. And because your communication was not good enough at that point, between 2, 3, and 4, or rather even like 5, things, I mean, it's kind of like that thing in math that we learn, like error carried forward, right? Like once an error is happening, it will keep on happening. It won't really correct itself because the process is kind of linear. Or linear process के अंदर, if a mistake happens at one point, then it will continue till the entire thing is uh, you know over. At which point you realize that things have not gone the way they should have gone. But one of the best ways of communication between design teams and development teams are design handoff. Design handoff आजकल mostly Figma पर ही होता है, because Figma has come out with such a good software and such a good product as well, and it has taken over the industry. इससे पहले there were other softwares as well. I, to be very frank, I am not aware of a lot of those softwares. मुझे सिर्फ Figma और Zeppelin का पता है, so I'm just gonna talk about them a bit. Figma is a pretty good software for design handoff. वहाँ पे you can like lay out the entire structure. It's a kind of like a free form software. वहाँ पे आप सारी details, सारी information डाल सकते हो. And using the dev mode, even developers can easily access all of those things. And Zeppelin used to be the product that was being used before Figma became such a good thing. But इन दोनों चीज़ों का जो है, इन दोनों प्रोडक्ट्स का, इन दोनों प्लेटफॉर्म्स का एक बहुत बड़ा इशू आता है. And that issue is that more often than not, there is one very major thing missing. And that major thing is context. Context क्या होता है? Context is why we're building the product. Once a developer receives some certain instructions or guidelines, they might start building the product straight away. Lekin the guidelines, if they're not very clear, there will be certain doubts. There will be certain questions. There might be, the developer might think that this is how I do things. These are my requirements. So this is how I will do these. I will build this thing as well. But the way they're thinking, they might be completely discounting why the product needs to be built or why the feature needs to be added. But uski wajah se, the way they do things, it might not be the right way to do things. It might not be the efficient way to do things. It might not be the sustainable way to do things. कि वो फीचर तो ऐड हो गया, लेकिन उस फीचर को डेवलप करने में, उस प्रोडक्ट को बिल्ड करने में, इट वाज बिल्ट इन आइसोलेशन. एंड बिकॉज इट वाज बिल्ट इन आइसोलेशन, थिंग्स आर काइंड ऑफ ब्रेकिंग. या फिर आगे जाके उस फीचर को स्केल करना या उस फीचर पे और चीज़ें ऐड करना, दोज बिकम अ ह्यूज पेन for the entire team or for whoever comes, after that, whichever feature comes after that as well. So having the context is extremely important. Having a good understanding of why the product or the feature needs to be built, it's just absolutely crucial for even a design handoff. तो आप डिजाइन हैंड ऑफ तो कर दोगे, बट if the context is missing, if the entire let's say if the entire story about why we're building what we're building is missing, then it just inefficiencies will keep on increasing. So apologies. So I mean, this is just a bit of why the context is necessary and the why the building process is actually important for developers, for designers, for product teams, for everyone on the team that's building something to understand. So I mean, there are ways of different ways of having that context, or the answer of why we're building something out there as well in the product team. Lekin more often than not, what happens is कि उसकी जो visibility होती है of that answer कि हम ये चीज़ क्यों बना रहे हैं, it's not consistent across the entire team. So a product owner may have a very good understanding of why we're building the product. A product manager might have a pretty good understanding. Designer को भी अच्छी खासी होगी. Researcher might have a different perspective. A developer might have a different perspective. QA might not even have, that kind of visibility. तो वो जो inconsistencies आपके आ जाती हैं between different members of the same team having different levels of understanding of the context of the story of the purpose of this entire product, that is one of the most major reasons for a communication gap and for those inefficiencies to occur. And to resolve those, there are multiple ways. One of those is one of those is user story. So some of you on this call might already know what user stories are, uh, but for those that do not know what user stories are, let's just briefly go through what exactly this thing is. User story is something that is a very basic, a very general explanation of what a feature is supposed to be within a product. So let's look at an example. For example, I want to be able to send a message on WhatsApp, right? Sending a message on WhatsApp is a feature. So defining that feature is what a user story will be. A user story will be simply an explanation of a very basic feature that is written from the perspective of the end user. So if I am a user that is trying to send a message on WhatsApp, then the user story will be written from my perspective. That I, as a user, want to send a message on WhatsApp. And we'll touch upon this further as well. This definition, I've picked up this definition from Atlassian. Atlassian is an industry leader in this kind of field, and I was like, let's just use that. It's right there on their page, it's everywhere. So the way they define it is an informal, general explanation of a software feature written from the perspective of the end user or the customer. इसमें एक और चीज भी आ जाती है. A user story has uh, slightly more, let's say, advanced version of it would be a short written explanation of a particular user's need and how it can be fulfilled within the agile development lifecycle. Now, why agile is important is because user stories are a major part of the agile development lifecycle, the way agile teams work. And if there are people on this call who do not know what agile is, I'm not going to go very deep into what agile is because that will be a completely different tangent. और वहाँ पे बातें और भी काफी सारी शुरू हो जाएंगी. And but basically, agile is a way of doing things within product teams. It allows a product team to be more iterative. It allows them to evolve their product as it's building, and it allows them to be more in touch with their end user as well. So those are some of the biggest benefits, some of the biggest reasons why agile has become kind of like the industry standard now. Lekin agile development में ये होता है कि the product team essentially is more closer to what the user actually needs, and the product that they're building, that product keeps evolving based on what the user needs. So it's not like कि आपने एक पूरी चीज़ एक साथ बना दी और फिर आपने प्रोडक्ट यूजर के सामने रख दी and then they have so many issues and then you go back, you build the entire thing again. Doesn't happen like that. It happens brick by brick, and each brick is something that the user, um, let's say, give their approval on. I mean, they don't like do a sign off or a or something like that. But what they do is कि जो भी आपकी चीज़ बन रही होती है, you get it tested very uh, thoroughly before you move on to the next thing. And if the thing that you're getting tested, if that's not working, sorry, if that thing is not working, then you go back to fixing the thing that was not working instead of continuing building the product. तो उसमें होता है कि आपकी जो foundation build हो रही होती है, your foundation is very strong. So in layman terms, that's what agile is. And because agile is so connected to the user, that's why user stories are such a huge part of agile as well. And at this point, I think if you guys have a good understanding of what agile is, what user stories are, so huh. So based on those definitions, I have a different way of defining what a user story is. Um, it might sound a bit more complicated than what we just saw. Lekin I think it's a bit more accurate representation and it's a more accurate analogy of what a user story is as well. So in my opinion, a user story is the most fundamental component of an atomic level blueprint that defines what your product is. So, and I mean, this is not just limited to your product, it could just be a feature set as well. But taking it in the light or in the context of a product just makes it more easier to understand. So let's suppose, for example, your product is, let's go back to that example, WhatsApp, right? So WhatsApp has a ton of features now. जब वो लॉन्च हुआ था WhatsApp तब तो उसके काफी लिमिटेड फीचर्स थे. It was mostly like instant messaging across the internet, but now it has a ton of other features as well. And every single individual feature would be a user story in the blueprint of what WhatsApp is supposed to be. And because a product is very complex, the more time it spends in the market, the more it grows, the more complex it becomes. A blueprint is an ideal way of explaining what an entire thing is. For example, जिस तरह पर कोई बिल्डिंग कंस्ट्रक्ट हो रही होती है, कोई चीज होती है, उसका एक पूरा पूरा ब्लूप्रिंट होता है, which is a very complicated document as well. But for someone who can easily, who's maybe like an architect or an engineer or someone, they can easily read what a blueprint is and they will understand everything that is written on that blueprint. So, in my opinion, a user story is the most fundamental component of an atomic level blueprint. और atomic level का मतलब ये है कि the amount of detail is supposed to be very granular. The amount of detail is supposed to go down into the depths, into the intricacies of what the entire product is. So it can't be very surface level. For example, जो भी एक हमने थोड़ी देर पहले the example we talked about was, as a user, I want to send a message on WhatsApp. That's, I mean, that is debatable, but in my opinion, that might not be uh, an atomic level feature. It might be slightly higher और atomic level पे थोड़ी सी ज़्यादा intricacy उसके अंदर होगी, थोड़ी सी ज़्यादा और चीज़ें उसके अंदर होगी which need to be considered before a user should be able to send a message across WhatsApp. Right. So again, just an explanation of what I think an atomic level blueprint is. And we talked about this as well, that the story needs to have all relevant details without sounding complex or ambiguous. Or complexity or ambiguity, the reason why I'm saying this is because a user story, even by existence, cannot solve the communication gap. ऐसा नहीं है कि आपने जो स्टोरी सिर्फ जो है ना वो बना दी है and you expect the communication gap to just like simply evaporate. That's not going to happen. Your user story needs to be good enough. It needs to be ideal enough for the entire team, for everyone involved in the entire project, in the entire product development life cycle, to actually be able to solve the communication gap or reduce the amount of inefficiency that might exist. Right. And some of you might have heard of what a PRD is, what a product requirement document is. वो भी काफी detailed होता है. That one has a lot of templates as well. There are people who are like experts on that. There are people who do know how to make like a very good PRD as well. In my opinion, an atomic level blueprint of what I think is like a user story, a collection of user stories is an atomic level blueprint that can be called the product requirement document, but I kind of disagree with that. I think a PRD is something separate, and a collection of user stories that define what a product is something which is slightly more different as well. Yeah. Okay. This might be a slightly controversial thing to say, and it's debatable. If someone wants to have a conversation on this later on, please feel free to reach out. But in my opinion, a very basic litmus test for how good a user story is, or maybe for how great a user story is that you have written, is that it should be good enough for even your end user to understand without having any prior product knowledge. And the reason why I'm putting this out there right now is even though we haven't even looked at how to write a user story, I'm just putting it out there to create that perspective कि यार आपकी user story, आपका जो fundamental component है of your entire blueprint of your entire product, it has to be so good, it has to be so detailed, it has to be, I mean, detailed, comprehensive, and still so simple and so easy enough to understand कि आप तो product team में हो, you have so much understanding, you have so much visibility of what the product is, but for someone who has no idea, I mean, you're building it for them, you're building it for the user, but essentially they have no idea of what the product is, right? अगर वो भी आपकी story को पढ़े, they should be able to understand what this thing or what this feature is about. It should not sound entirely foreign to them. And I mean, this is the end of the spectrum. It's not like कि आपकी हर आप user story आपकी ऐसी होनी चाहिए, or without this a user story cannot exist or anything. But this is just a good litmus test to make sure that the way you're writing stories or the way you're communicating within your product team is effective enough. क्योंकि अगर कोई जो है वो someone outside the team can also understand what's happening, and someone outside the team can read the user story and be like कि यार मुझे हाँ समझ आ गई है, then that does not leave any kind of excuse or any kind of room for just saying कि oh, for anyone in the product team to go like कि मुझे user story समझ नहीं आई, या फिर along the lines of like they might not be able to work with that story as well. So again, just an opinion, just a basic litmus test, not something that you have to follow, not something set in stone at all. So okay, now let's move on to how to write a great story. So I'm sure some of you do know what how to write your stories. Some of you have written stories as well. Some of you have gone through this entire process as well. Some of you have faced this hurdle as well कि यार आपने जो स्टोरी लिखी थी वो इतनी अच्छी नहीं थी, ये नहीं थी, वो नहीं थी, ये डिटेल मिसिंग थी, वो डिटेल मिसिंग थी. All of those things. So anyone who has been part of a product team ever has probably gone through this entire ordeal of creating tickets and all of this and those things. And you probably have your own way of writing stories as well. You probably have your own softwares to write stories on as well. You probably have your own way of communicating within the product team as well. And in no way am I saying कि यार आप लोग जो करते हो वो गलत है. This is just a session to help you guys enhance whatever you are doing, and maybe increase the efficiency of the entire product development lifecycle, and to increase the efficiency of your communication within your team as well, right? Okay, this is just like a fun thing which I added. Um, I don't know if you recognize any of these three people. If someone does, please like write it in the comments or something. But in fact, let's give it a minute to see if people do recognize these three people or not. Partner, if someone raises their hand, just like let me know as well, or just like let them speak if they
Yeah,
want to say something about this.
yeah, अभी तक तो no one has. Maybe we can just take a screenshot and ask GPT.
Take a screenshot. No, it's not a test. You don't need to score marks on this. It's just like, well, I mean, okay. If no one has any idea of who these people are some of the most prolific storytellers in the last couple of 100 years. So the person on the left, that's Arthur Conan Doyle, the creator of Sherlock Holmes. The person on the top right is Roald Dahl. I'm pretty sure you guys have heard of Roald Dahl. बचपन में काफी like मेरे बचपन में एटलीस्ट मैंने बहुत स्टोरीज पढ़ी थी रोल्ड डाल की. I don't know if he was part of your बचपन या जवानी or whatever. And below on the bottom right is Professor Tolkien, the creator of Lord of the Rings. And I hope some of you on the call recognize these people after I've called out their names. And the reason why I've done this is because ये तो खैर पुराने थे. They used to write, like physically write stories. आजकल का जो जमाना है उसमें we watch, our storytelling is limited to watching TikTok videos with like Subway Surfer running under, like उनके नीचे, like ये सब चीजें हमारे इसमें चलती होती हैं. So like what I'm trying to say is कि the way storytelling is done, the medium, the platform has changed across centuries, but there is something that is very common across all of them. And the next person you guys all will probably recognize as well, as he is also known as a very great storyteller, even though he lies in a completely different category. And he's more relevant to the topic today as well, because he was a brilliant leader and a great uh, visionary, I would say, but he was also a superb presenter and a superb storyteller. If you guys have seen the way he presented the iPhone back in 2007, yes, his presentations, of course. So, उसमें भी यही करता है. He just tells very good stories, and that's the entirety of what Apple does as well. Apple tells really great stories. They market their products in a way कि आपको उस पे यकीन हो जाता है. Even though they're not doing anything very innovative, they're not doing anything, just like which is completely out of the blue. They're just like selling the story, selling the idea in a much better way. And across the three people that we saw before on the previous slide, and Steve Jobs, there is one thing that's common across their narrative. There is a beginning, there is a middle, and there is an ending of that narrative. And these three things are wrapped in a context and within relevancy as well. Why context and relevancy matter? Because without a context, a beginning, a middle, or an end won't really make sense. Without relevancy, a beginning, a middle, and an ending is something that you won't be interested in. तो अगर आपको समझ नहीं आएगा कि ये चीज़ आई कहाँ से है, और अगर आपको ये समझ आ गया कि ये चीज़ कहाँ से आई है लेकिन आपका उसमें कोई इंटरेस्ट नहीं है, कोई शौक नहीं है, there is no reason for you to just like involve yourself in it. You're not going to do it, right? You're not going to get involved, and you're just it won't be a good story. That's pretty much it. And if you look back and try to remember every good story, or if any like even movies bhi aap dekh lo, right? Some of the best movies out there, and they have a pretty good premise, they have a pretty good context as well. They're very relevant, even though they're fiction. They might be completely fantasy, they might be completely fiction as well, but they have a certain level of relevancy and they have a certain level of context as well that allows the beginning, the middle, and the end to make more sense to you. And when the story finishes, you are left with a much better understanding of what was conveyed to you. Right. So, and the reason why I brought this up is because a user story, even though इस level पे कहीं से भी नहीं होती है, I mean, like you can't expect to write like Lord of the Rings Part 2 just for a Jira ticket. But the thing is that the main concept of how a good story is built does translate into how good user story is written. वो आप Jira पे लिखो कहीं और लिखो, it doesn't matter, but the way a good user story is written does kind of, let's say, is dependent on how a good story is told. So now let's move on to a typical template or a typical format of how a user story is written. Some of you might recognize this. Again, some of you might have probably written stories. Some of you might write stories in this way as well. Some of you might not. It's completely fine. If that works for your team, that's brilliant. If if you write it this way, that's also pretty good. But typically in the industry, in the product industry, user stories are written in this manner that as a user or a persona, I want to perform a certain action so that I, as a user or a persona, I can achieve a certain result. तो इसमें तीन चीजें आ गई हैं, right? And those three things are the user or the persona, which defines the type of user that will be using this feature. And the reason why that is important is because you need to define who your user is. If you do not define who your user is, then that removes the context from your story as well. Right? ये feature है किसके लिए? You need to define that because otherwise it just will not really make sense. Perform a certain action, the feature that the user that was defined earlier in the story will be using or interacting with. You need to define that feature as well because without defining that feature, I mean, the story won't really exist, right? कि आपने आपने perform करना क्या, like what's the action, what's that feature will allow you to perform. And once I'm done performing that action, once I'm done with that interaction, once I'm done interacting with that feature, what result will I end up with? And so I can achieve a certain result. The end result of the user defined earlier, interacting with that feature, which has also been defined earlier in the story. So this is a very basic industry-wide accepted format or template to write an ideal user story. And just let's focus on the word ideal because इससे पहले जो हम use कर रहे थे, we were looking at how to write a great user story. But right now we're just focusing on what an ideal user story is. And an ideal user story is something that can, you know, is it's good enough. It's not something that's brilliant. It's not something that's going to stand out. It's not something that will increase the efficiency of a product team significantly. It's just something that will not fail. बस ठीक है मुनासिब है ये उस तरह से right. So if you use this template, if you use this formula, if you use this format, you will be able to write an ideal user story, right? इसमें हुआ ये है कि what we saw earlier, where we had a beginning, a middle, and an end, has now been replaced with a persona, a need, and a purpose. But again, those things are wrapped in context and relevancy. Because if there is no context, then the story will again not be good enough. If it is not relevant, it won't make sense. It won't spark that interest. It won't really allow the person who's reading that story or who that story is intended for कि उनका जब वो चीज़ develop नहीं होगी वो शौक develop नहीं होगा they won't really be involved, they won't really take ownership of that story as well, right? So let's do a short exercise over here if you guys are willing to interact or like speak or something, but in fact Fatma, we don't need to like speak करने की जरूरत नहीं है, we can if people want to, it's fine. But if they want to post things in the chat, that's also completely fine. So I want you guys to just send me a list of, let's say, different products. अच्छा, exercise ये है कि basically what we'll do is we'll take a product, we will select a specific feature within that product, and based on this format, we will try to write a user story for that specific feature. So
Maybe
what
you
we
can
need,
you
I need
just
from you
use
guys.
Apple since you've mentioned Steve Jobs as a product or iPhone.
नहीं, it's better if it comes from the people because then it will be able to like वो relevancy create हो जाएगी ना फिर, because they'll be
Mm-hmm.
thinking along those lines as well instead of just like following what I'm trying to say.
Mm-hmm.
So I just need a product from you guys. Yeah, just like an app name or website name and a feature within that product as well.
Mm. Snapchat. Snapchat, we can do Snapchat and filters.
Or
Snapchat के जो filter
what's a
feature
feature within a Snapchat?
feature वही जो filters होते हैं उसके that could be a feature. The
Mm-hmm.
different filters you use. Finding a
Finding
filter
a
on
filter, that's interesting, right? So finding a filter and using a filter are two different features,
interesting.
right? Finding a filter will means you have to go to search or maybe you have to scroll, right? Like you have to scroll right or left. And selecting a filter will be, or applying a filter will be completely different as well. So if we write, let's suppose, a user story on that, on finding a filter on Snapchat, not uh, applying or implementing a feature. So उसके लिए what we first need is a user or a persona. So over here, what we can do is either we can go with, like a standard user, or we can define a specific user or a specific persona as well. So if anyone has an idea on maybe defining a persona for Snapchat, please feel free to put it on the chat. Or if you guys do not, then we can just go with a user as well.
So how would you define the persona? Like what characteristics, or is it like open? We can use whatever we want, like generation, age, all of that.
So those are characteristics of a persona.
Yeah.
But if you want to define, let's say, what a persona is, you can just like label anyone. Like for example, a content creator will be a different persona.
Mm-hmm.
A teenager will be a different persona.
Okay. Okay.
Things like that. So just define anything. A non-tech person who doesn't use mobile often. Okay, that's
Interesting.
interesting.
Yeah.
So
Hmm.
as a boomer, right? I mean, this person is a boomer. So as a boomer, I'm just gonna write something, right? So as a boomer, okay, imprint. We'll come to imprint as a resume in a bit. So as a boomer, I want to. What's the action? I want to
Click a
search.
picture. Oh नहीं हमें search करना था हाँ.
Yeah, we have to search for a
Funny filter.
specific filter.
For a filter that shows me how I looked when I was young, maybe something like that. Because उसमें वो भी होता है
हाँ
ना
और
एज
ज़्यादा
कर
दिमाग
देते
चला
हैं
मेरा.
यंग कर या हाउ आई विल लुक 20 years from now maybe that but
That's a
I
very
think
specific filter. That is a
and
very, very specific filter.
and I don't think the our persona would even know कि इस तरह का कुछ है भी since they don't know how to use
Exactly.
Snapchat.
Exactly, like a non-tech person, right? So that I can enhance, right? So I'm just sending a sample story on chat, right? Which works for the example that we just discussed. And then
Nice.
assume you had an app called Imprint. So if you can do the same for Imprint as well, I think that would be pretty great. Okay, choose a specific feature, choose a persona, uh, define what action can be performed, and then what result can be achieved by performing that action, if you want to, of course. Yeah, I guess not. चले कोई नहीं आगे बढ़ते Okay, so this is the part where we're going into how to make an ideal user story, something that becomes a great user
Assume did
story.
message. Yeah.
Okay. Understands things through images and not words. I want to understand a law of science, philosophy, or psychologically in a graphical representation that I can apply them in daily life.
That's so like technical. That's a big
No, that's
statement.
good. I mean, like it
Yeah,
follows
it's
the same
good.
format,
Yep.
but the problem with this is it's not on an atomic level, right? It's not like on a granular level. It doesn't. It's too broad. अगर आप ये user story लिखोगे तो इसमें the amount of details that you will have to enter to define this entire feature set, I would not even call it a feature, I would call it a feature set. उसमें होगा ये कि उसमें ना फिर details बहुत ज़्यादा आ जाएंगी. And we're going to look at that in the next few slides as well कि अगर details अगर आप ज़्यादा ऐड करोगे तो उसका एक नुकसान भी हो सकता है. Yeah, it's an entire scope, right? Like, I want to understand any law of science, philosophy, or psychologically in a graphical representation. So I feel like this can be broken down further into multiple different user stories that can allow um, a product team to be very easily able to implement that feature as well. Design, development, QA, backend, frontend, सब कुछ जो है ना वो एक साथ उसका हो सके. So I feel like this is good. This is on that template, but it needs to be broken down even further. Okay. Um, let's move on to what a description of the user story is. जो story हमने लिखी थी अभी, the user story, that was just a title. It was simply a title that defined what that feature is in a very simple language. लेकिन वो उसके details में नहीं गया था. Like even for the one that we saw on Snapchat, if you simply provide this title or this statement to someone, like let's suppose a designer or a developer, they would have a ton of questions around it. They would require even more detail. They would require even more comprehensive details around it. कि अच्छा सही है ये तो है समझ आ गया मुझे क्या करना है but how do I do it, right? So the description talks about the why and the how, and a description is basically an explanation of that blueprint. तो जो आपका blueprint बन गया है आप आपकी स्टोरी के टाइटल से, you have a product, you've broken down that product into multiple different uh, components, and each component is on an atomic level is building up the blueprint. And now that blueprint requires, certain explanations, certain details to make sure it also makes sense. It can't just be like lines and images and structures that only make sense to someone who has built the entire thing, and someone from the outside, when they look at it, उनको समझ ही ना आए. ऐसा नहीं हो सकता. आपकी जो है वो your entire product blueprint needs to be much more comprehensive than that. And the comprehensiveness comes from the description. And these are the few components of a description of a story that should be there. Um, and of course, if you guys have any ideas on how to improve this list, or like if you guys do it a bit differently, feel free to share. But there should be a context for where that story is coming from. There should be links. to other features, other stories that exist as part of that blueprint. There should be a detailed acceptance criteria कि इस story में अगर ये सब कुछ होगा, then the story will be accepted or the story will, let's say in a product team, the story will be passed. Right? Pass का मतलब ये होता है कि you define a set of interactions that will happen within that story for the user to be able to perform that action and achieve a certain result. For example, filters वाली जो बात थी, अगर आप scroll नहीं कर पा रहे, you're not able to select a specific filter. Or maybe let's suppose the search bar where you can search for a filter, अगर आप वहाँ पे type नहीं कर पा रहे हो, then you're not able to search, right? So the action of searching is dependent on a lot of different interactions. It's dependent on a lot of different things as well. So on how to perform that action on each and every single interaction, each and every single method of how you can perform that action and the results that you can achieve with that action, those become part of the acceptance criteria. So आपका acceptance criteria वहाँ पे होना जरूरी है. You may add important notes for the team for each story. For example, कि please, just be aware of this thing, or just make sure that this thing is happening in this way. Maybe like there is a specific edge case or something that needs to be accounted for in a separate manner. कुछ भी हो सकता है, right? So just having that thing in your mind, कि हाँ, maybe if there is something different, I need to have it as part of the important note section, or maybe I just need to mention it separately as well. That's important too. You may or may not include special instructions for the developer. अगर आप include कर देते हो, that makes the story pretty great. That makes it very solid. That makes the amount of detail that's in there pretty good as well. उससे होता ही है कि when the story goes on to a developer, and just for context, what happens is that the story जो भी लिख रहा होता है, usually there is someone else who works on that story. So usually the person who writes that story is not the one who works on it. अगर ऐसा हो कि जो स्टोरी लिख रहा है वही उस पर काम कर रहा हो, तो फिर तो in like an ideal world, in a utopian world, everything would be just like, you know, pretty good. But ऐसा अक्सर नहीं होता. Someone else writes the story and someone else works on it. So if you have any special instructions for the developer, that would make their life a lot easier, and that would automatically reduce the amount of communication gap or the inefficiency that might exist across the entire story or feature or sprint. Design details. Uh, this is again something which is slightly controversial. People do say कि आप design details add ना करो story के अंदर. It's an industry-wide practice as well कि design details is entirely dependent on the designer and not the person who's writing the stories. But in my opinion, this should be there to a certain extent. It should not be कि आप पूरा UI वहाँ पे define कर रहे हो कि आपने button का size ये होना चाहिए, padding कितनी होनी चाहिए, size like placement ये होनी चाहिए, all of those things. But it should give enough directions to the designer as well so that they can verify their own designs as well. If they have a feature set, they have made their designs, or on designs ko, maybe there is a couple of states missing, maybe there is an edge case that's missing, maybe there is some copy that's non-existent, maybe there is an interaction which a designer has made in a certain way, and the product owner or someone who's writing the story thinks it should be done in a different way. It just allows the designer to have a reference to make sure that they can cross-check their designs with, and the entire team can be on the same page. आपकी डिजाइन आइसोलेशन में नहीं हो रही होगी, आपकी स्टोरी राइटिंग आइसोलेशन में नहीं हो रही होगी, और आपकी डेवलपमेंट भी आइसोलेशन में नहीं हो रही होगी. If all of these things are there on a user story, so then at a very fundamental level, this does become your building block. This does hold. This does become the only source of truth of a feature within a product. So and a bunch of user stories with this level of description and with this level of detail can become, like something even better than the product requirement document. Why so many details? Of course, these bring the entire team onto one page, and they just They just reduce their efficiency significantly. They just allow the entire team to be aware के context क्या है, relevancy क्या है, purpose, need, users कौन से हैं, डिजाइन का किस तरह से उसका बनना है, बैक एंड डिटेल्स क्या है, फ्रंट एंड डिटेल्स क्या है, एवरीथिंग इज पार्ट ऑफ वन स्पेसिफिक टिकट और वन स्पेसिफिक यूजर स्टोरी that just exists within a blueprint or within a backlog, and that a bunch of those will build up your product. और उसमें होगा ये कि visibility आपकी across the entire team, the visibility can be in the same place. You don't have to go through multiple things कि यहाँ जाके मैं इस चीज़ को देखूँ, यहाँ यहाँ जाके मैं इस चीज़ को देखूँ. Someone has a different idea of why the product is being built. Someone has a different idea of why the product is being built. Someone has a different idea of how the product should be built. Someone has a different understanding of how to test the product. तो वो जो inconsistencies आ जाती हैं because there is no single source of truth, those can be reduced by having a very good, a very detailed, and a very thorough user story that defines each and every single granular feature in a very comprehensive manner. But yet again, simple enough. ऐसा नहीं होना चाहिए कि आपने एक स्टोरी लिख ली है और आपने स्टोरी वो लिख ली उसके बाद फिर देयर वाज अ डेवलपर दैट्स वर्किंग ऑन दैट एंड ड्यू टू सम रीजन दे हैड टू लीव और समथिंग लाइक दैट एंड देन इफ समवन न्यू कम्स इन उनको कुछ समझ ही ना आए कि स्टोरी के अंदर बात क्या हो रही है. A story, a good user story, sorry, a great user story should not be something like that. No, we are not going to be talking about a design handoff in this. This is mostly about how to assist a design handoff. So it's something which complements a design handoff. Again, आपकी जो initial research होती है, which starts off with UX research and design, verbalizing that in the form of a user story, it just helps reduce the risk even further. तो आपकी रिसर्च में कोई चीज़ आ गई होगी, अब there is something that you had an idea about, there is something that you saw, there is probably an edge case or something that you recognize, but डिजाइन करते हुए कुछ करते हुए वो चीज़ थोड़ी सी रह गई. And verbalizing all of those, just make sure कि if there is an idea that was left unaccounted for, if there was a screen that was left unaccounted, if there was a scenario that was left unaccounted for, those things can be very easily, uh, I would say, caught or recognized when you try to verbalize your designs. So if you translate your designs that have been made into something that is a user story, that is a very detailed story, then those things can be caught as well. And of course, like we talked about this earlier as well, it could definitely act as a cross reference for the design team as well, just to make sure कि जो design हम लोगों ने बनाए हैं, वो designs are they according to what the requirements are they according to what the feature set requires, or are they, you know, insufficient या थोड़ा different है या क्या हो गया. So the question is, there a limit to how many user stories can should be incorporated in a project? So there is no limit. I mean, you should at least have one, right? So, but there is no limit as such. अगर आप चाहो तो आप जो है वो एक छोटे से फीचर की भी जो है वो कुछ 100-200 स्टोरीज बना सकते हो. If you want, you can make like one or two of them as well. It is entirely dependent on what the team requires, and something which we will look at right now as well in a bit. Sorry for that. Acha, this is another framework for writing a great story, and this framework is called invest. Invest का मतलब ये है कि every single user story that you write should ideally be independent, negotiable, valuable, estimable, small, and testable. इसका मतलब ये होता है, इंडिपेंडेंट का मतलब ये होता है बेसिकली कि यूजर स्टोरी शुड नॉट बी डिपेंडेंट इन द सेंस के uh, खैर, the reason why I'm getting a bit stuck is because I kind of disagree with this thing as well. वो मैं उसमें बाद में आऊंगा. But independent essentially means in the industry is that a story should be able to be developed in isolation. उसको किसी कोई और चीज उसके ऊपर डिपेंड ना करिए, यही चीज किसी और चीज पर डिपेंड ना करिए, राइट. Negotiable means that the story एक दफा लिखी जा चुकी है, उसके बाद it should be able to, like, you know, keep on changing, requirements add हो रही है, remove हो रही है based on discussions, based on what the product or the feature requires. Valuable means it should add some sort of value. It should not just be there to uh, just like sit pretty and do nothing, right? It should not be like that. It should add some sort of value to the entire product. Estimable means that the story should be estimated, should not be uh, so huge, so broad कि आप उसकी एस्टिमेशन ही इतनी आ जाए कि आपके जो है ना वो टाइमलाइन के अंदर या रिसोर्सेज से या जो लिमिटेशन है उसके अंदर वो फिट ना हो रही हो. Small again should be ideally like enough for a developer to work on. And testable means कि कोई ऐसी चीज़ हो जो properly test भी हो सके. It should not be so ambiguous कि वो test ही ना हो सके. This is the industry-wide accepted definition of invest. I have slightly different one. I mean, if you guys watch Pokemon, you might understand what this is. But uh, I think evolved should be there. And evolved का मतलब ये है कि a story or the way you write a user story should evolve with your team. It should evolve with how your team does things. It should evolve based on your team dynamics. It should evolve based on how your team operates. It should evolve on what kind of language, what kind of understanding your team has with each other, and the template, the format, uh, I would even say the design of the story should evolve how things are with how the team operates. So just a slight disagreement I have with the industry-wide accepted definition of what invest is. Because if the story is not evolving with the team, then essentially the story is not helping the team the way it's supposed to. If it's stuck on a certain pattern, then you're asking the team to evolve the other way. Rather than evolving something that can be evolved and help the team, you're asking the team to evolve based on how things are done across the industry, even though that's not what the project or the product might be, what the product might be requiring, right? Um, so then, based on
We
everything else
also
that
have
we
a
just saw,
question. Did you answer that? Sorry, I had a
no, I just thought
yeah. When we define a user story.
when we define a user story and keep adding details to it, how can we probably determine that now is a good time to break it into smaller user stories? I'll take this at the end, Fatma, because अभी वो एक ही story से आगे जाके आएगी.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, okay.
How to write a great user story is जो हमने उसका formula पढ़ा था, the three things: persona, a purpose, and a need. Then we saw how to write a detailed and relevant description so that you can add the meat to the story. एक तो आपका टाइटल बन गया, फिर आपकी सारी डिटेल्स आ गई हैं. You have a good solid detail. And the third thing that adds, I would say, like the cherry on top, is the template and language that the entire product team agrees on, and yet is still simple enough to pass the litmus test. The litmus test that we saw at the start of the presentation case should be good enough for a user that has no idea of what the product is कि उसके भी समझ में आ जाए. Right. If a story fulfills all of these three things, then it can definitely be considered a great user story. Okay, we'll take Jawad's question first. When we define a user story and keep adding details to it, how can we probably determine that now is a good time to break it into smaller user stories? So, Jawad, I think this is relevant to the third point, a template and language that the entire product team agrees on, and yet is still simple enough to pass the litmus test. यहाँ पे this is where you as a product owner or a manager, a designer, developer, जो भी हो, this is where you as a team decide कि हाँ, this is the limit of the story. And this is also dependent on this framework कि आपने देखना है कि story is the story small enough or not. And you also have to determine if the story is crossing that threshold that you have decided upon as a team कि story इतनी छोटी होनी चाहिए, इससे बड़ी होगी तो हम इसको break down कर देंगे. That is when you start breaking it down into multiple other stories so that the level of detail in one single story does not exceed a certain limit. and the level of complexity in a certain story also does not exceed a certain limit, right? Does that I hope that answers your question though. Okay, just a few, just we were ending it in like a 5 6 minutes with just like a few common misconceptions. सबसे पहली ये है कि a user story is for the developer, it is not for the developer, it's for the entire product team. बिकॉज यहाँ पे फिर ये होता है कि जहाँ डेवलपर को इस तरह काम करना है, the story is going to the developer, so we should write it based on how the developer will understand it. That is absolutely not true. Anyone from the product team should be able to read that story at any point in time and be able to understand कि यहाँ पे क्या बात हो रही है. If you write it from the perspective of just a developer, you will miss out on so many important details, and you might even miss out on details that are relevant for the developer to understand कि ये स्टोरी किस तरह से बननी चाहिए और क्यों बननी चाहिए, right? Another misconception is that anyone can write a user story, and I mean, yes, it can be written by anyone. कोई भी आके लिख सकता है user story, but ideally, what should happen is that the ownership and the responsibility should be given to the person with the highest amount of visibility in all aspects of the product. So usually, this is the product owner because they're part of the research, they're part of the design process, they're part of the development team, they're part of the management team. They have the highest amount of visibility. So ideally, a story should be approved or passed by someone who has the highest amount of visibility because only they can ensure that जितनी भी detail story के अंदर है, those details are relevant for every single person on the team. Not every single person that will be working on that story, but every single person on that team. So that is a misconception कि हाँ कोई भी story लिख सकता है, but usually what happens is that when multiple people are writing stories on the same product, on the same feature, the amount of inconsistencies, inefficiencies, and communication gaps significantly increase. And that does cause a lot of trouble for the QA phase. And this one, a user story should be independent. My disagreement with this is that a user story should be independent, but not without support. Every single product that we see out there nowadays is so complex and has so many different working parts. And this also relates to Sarah's question of how many stories there should be. There should be as many stories as you feel like there need to be. क्योंकि a product has many working parts and no single part can work without the other part working as well. So a story should always have a support. It should not be entirely or so independent कि आपको समझ ही ना आए कि या फिर वो बिल्कुल आइसोलेशन में नहीं होनी चाहिए. It should be connected. It should have links. It should have support through with other features within that same product as well. Just a slightly fresh concluding perspective on everything that we've looked at in this session. Okay, when you consolidate the perspective of a designer, a developer, a researcher, uh, a project manager, everyone on the entire team onto a single platform, on a single source of truth, on a single granular source of truth, a user story, that significantly reduces the communication gap. And that allows for a medium to exist, for a platform, not even a medium to exist or a source to exist where everyone can come in, they can refer to that source, and it becomes a single source of truth. Designer can check their designs, QA can check their test cases, a developer can understand what the story is, why the story needs to be built, how the story needs to be built, and where it needs to be connected as well. So, as a product manager, as a product owner, as someone who is maybe simply writing the stories, if you're able to achieve this level of, I would say, detail and efficiency within your product team, then that is the height of communication that you have reached, especially between two teams that are mostly at war with each other, the design team and the development team. And this is just my opinion. Uh, I hope this was something good enough for you guys to learn something from. And the next time you write a user story, or the next time you even read a story someone else has written, you'll be able to identify the ways of improving those stories and just overall improving the efficiency of your product team as well. So now, if anyone has any questions, any feedback, any thoughts to share, they feel free to please share those.
Again, you guys can either raise your hand and I will unmute you, or you can type in the chat if you have any questions. Thank you for the session though, Bilal.
No worries, Fatma. I just hope that some people got something to learn from it. No question, just a thumbs up. Great.
नहीं, किसी ने चैट में बोला है ऑसम सेशन, हिबा ने बोला है,
No,
यस
no,
इट वाज अ ग्रेट
वो तो
सेशन.
मैंने देख लिया. I was like,
Yeah.
हाँ,
So we can give it another minute or two if anyone's
sure.
typing in the chat. But to everyone, you guys will receive another email if you registered through our Calendly link for feedback on the session. So you can also give it over there. Uh, Other than that, you will also receive the recording of the session in the next week, which we will upload on our YouTube channel. So, yeah. Yeah, someone has asked something, Bilal, in the chat.
If there's a conflict between testability and deployability of a story, what should we lean towards? I mean, deployability, of course, because something cannot be tested properly without being deployed. और अगर वहाँ पे कोई मेजर टेक्निकल इशू आ गया देन टेस्टिंग इज समथिंग दैट कम्स लेटर ऑन इन द प्रोडक्ट डेवलपमेंट लाइफ साइकिल. अगर आप कोई चीज़ डिप्लॉय नहीं कर पा रहे हो या अगर देयर इज अ डेवलपमेंट कंस्ट्रेंट देन दैट constraint will factor into the testability of that thing as well. So deployability should definitely take the priority over here. And over here, Jawad, I'm assuming tested by testability, you mean that the QA phase. Right? Let me try a few features with feature flag and everything is available later on when the puzzle is. I'm not sure what you mean by the puzzle. Ah, okay. नहीं, मैं जवाब के वो देख रहा हूँ because I think, yeah, in my opinion, deployability and from what I understand, if testability is the QA phase, then of course a single story has to be testable. So जब भी आपकी story लिख रहे हो तो आप define कर रहे हो तो उस feature को you need to make sure that that story individually can be tested. And the testing might be dependent on some other feature as well, but the feature defined within that story specifically should also be testable. Or अगर deployability means technical constraints in the sense कि आप कोई चीज़ develop नहीं कर पा रहे हो या आप उसको deploy नहीं कर पा रहे हो, then of course that takes the priority because if something is not deployed, then it cannot be properly tested as well. So I hope that helps. I hope my understanding of that question was correct as well. Okay, what technical expertly required to be a product manager? What difference between project manager and product manager? So, I mean, I have opinions on this. Uh, I mean, project manager usually in the industry-wide thing is accepted as someone who is managing just the project, which means the people, the different moving parts of an entire project of an entire team. And the product manager जो होता है वो आपका they usually are managing the product alongside the team as well. But because a project manager takes over the responsibility of managing the team, the product manager simply looks at those aspects of a team that are linked to the product, right? This is what I have seen. Uh, in my opinion, unless your organization or unless your product is so complicated that it cannot function without a project manager. In my opinion, in a small team, in a small scale startup, or like even a big scale startup, जहाँ पे आपकी product is not very, very complex, for example, if not like Microsoft or Google, just two very basic examples, right, of like giant products. वहाँ पे I do not think that a product manager or a project manager should be very different. But again, that's my opinion. That's based on my experiences as well. So technical expertise की अगर आप बात करें to be a product manager, you need to have a solid understanding of design principles, research principles, UX, not really UI, and also a very good understanding of how development works. Because you need to be part of you are the central node of an entire product team that involves lots of different people. So अगर आपको understanding नहीं होगी and if it's difficult for you to build that kind of understanding, then you will have issues as a product manager. I hope that answers the question, Naman.
Also, even from your experience, sorry, I'm just adding, like you, like for a client at CC, you sort of played the role of a product manager, and
Mm-hmm.
the project managers were the ones who were sort of aligning everyone when it came to
Yeah.
tasks. So yeah, maybe that could also be the difference.
Mm-hmm. UI UX design knowledge is compulsory. It's not compulsory, but it should not be something that you're resistant to. तो ऐसा नहीं होना चाहिए कि आपको बिल्कुल ही नहीं आता उसके बारे में. Should be something that you are, at the very least, it should be something you're willing to learn and willing to actively learn as well. It's not compulsory. ऐसा नहीं है कि आपको सारे डिजाइन प्रिंसिपल्स आने चाहिए, ऐसा नहीं है आपको सारी यूएक्स रिसर्च प्रिंसिपल्स आने चाहिए. बट यू शुड हैव अ बेसिक नॉलेज, अ बेसिक अंडरस्टैंडिंग के इतनी होनी चाहिए कि आप डिजाइनर से बात कर सको ऑन हिज इन हिज ओन लैंग्वेज और इन हर ओन लैंग्वेज.
Any more questions, or we can call it a day? Hmm. I think we can give it another minute if anyone wants to type. Thank you everyone for attending. Uh, we will be sharing the recording as well, and you guys can see the slides in there. So overall, really great session. We have a few people left by now, but thank you everyone. Thank you Bilal. Thank you the audience, and I
Mm-hmm.
think we can wrap it up then. Uh, Looking forward to see you all
Yep.
next year for the next learning series session, guys.
All right, thank you
Okay.
everyone.
Thank you. Yeah, next year because 2025. Yeah, it will
Yeah.
happen in 2 months. So yeah.